Part 1. The Fallen Maestro. The cold autumn wind cut through David's thin jacket as he sat on the concrete steps outside Romano's Italian restaurant. His fingers were numb, not just from the cold, but from the constant shaking that had started 3 years ago when he came back from his last tour overseas. The fancy restaurant behind him buzzed with warm conversations and the clinking of expensive silverware, but David might as well have been on a different planet. He pulled his old army cap lower over his eyes and adjusted the small cardboard sign propped against his worn boots. Veteran in need. Anything helps. God bless. The words were written in careful block letters the same way he used to write reports for his commanding officer, back when he had a purpose, back when people respected him. A couple walked past, their designer shoes clicking on the sidewalk. The woman glanced down at David, and he saw that familiar look cross her face. The same look everyone gave him now. Part pity, part disgust, part fear. She quickly looked away and hurried her husband along. David had gotten used to being invisible, but David hadn't always been invisible. 20 years ago, his name was printed on concert programs in beautiful gold letters. David Rodriguez, piano soloist. He had performed in concert halls across the country, his fingers dancing across piano keys with the kind of precision that made audiences hold their breath. Music critics had called him a rising star and a master of emotional expression. That felt like someone else's life now. David's hands trembled as he reached for the small coffee cup beside him, counting the few coins and crumpled bills inside. $2.37. Not enough for a real meal. Barely enough for a candy bar from the gas station down the street. His stomach cramped with hunger, a feeling he'd become all too familiar with over the past year. He remembered the last time he'd eaten a proper meal. It was at the shelter 3 days ago, but they were full up now. Winter was coming, and every bed was taken by someone just like him. Someone who had fallen through the cracks of a system that seemed designed to forget about people like them. The irony wasn't lost on David. He could see the beautiful black grand piano through the restaurant's large windows. It sat in the center of the dining room like a piece of art, polished to perfection but silent. The restaurant played soft background music from hidden speakers instead, probably some generic playlist that cost them $50 a month. David knew that piano was worth more than most people made in a year. He could tell by the way the light reflected off its surface, by the elegant curve of its legs, by the distinctive shape of its music stand. It was a Steinway, possibly a Model D. He had played pianos just like it in some of the most prestigious venues in the world. Now he couldn't even afford to walk through the front door. A young family walked by, their little girl skipping between her parents. She looked about 7 years old with bright eyes and a pink backpack covered in cartoon characters. For just a moment she broke away from her parents and walked over to David. Without saying a word, she dropped a dollar bill into his cup and smiled at him. "Thank you, sweetheart," David managed to say, his voice hoarse from not speaking much lately. "Mommy says we should help people who are sad," the girl said simply. Her mother quickly appeared, taking the girl's hand with an apologetic smile toward David. "Come on, honey. Let's go inside." But the girl's innocent kindness hit David harder than all the dirty looks and ignored pleas combined. He watched them disappear into the warm glow of the restaurant, and for a moment, he remembered what it felt like to be human, to matter. David had tried so hard to get back on his feet after coming home from Afghanistan. The nightmares made it impossible to sleep. The loud noises from the city made him jump and sweat. His hands shook so badly some days that he couldn't hold a coffee cup, let alone play a piano with the delicate touch that had once been his trademark. He'd gone to the VA hospital, waited in long lines, filled out endless paperwork. They gave him pills that made him feel like he was underwater, therapy sessions that felt like interrogations, and appointments that were scheduled months apart. The benefits he was promised seemed to get tangled up in red tape and computer systems that never seemed to work right. Meanwhile, his savings disappeared. First on medical bills that weren't covered, then on rent for an apartment he could no longer afford. Finally on food and basic necessities as he watched his old life slip away piece by piece. His former agent stopped returning his calls when David couldn't guarantee he'd be able to perform without his hands shaking. The classical music world was small and competitive. Word got around quickly when a performer became unreliable. David understood their position. but it still stung when doors that had once opened easily for him suddenly slammed shut. The restaurant's dinner crowd was starting to arrive now. Well-dressed couples and business people walked past David as if he were part of the sidewalk furniture. Their conversations were full of complaints about work deadlines, vacation plans, and which wine to order with dinner. Problems that David would have given anything to have again. He pulled his jacket tighter around his thin frame. He'd lost almost 40 pounds since becoming homeless. Food was expensive when you had to buy it one meal at a time from convenience stores and fast food places. The shelter meals were filling but only came once a day, and only if you were lucky enough to get in line early. As the sun began to set, David knew he needed to make a decision. He had enough money for either a cheap meal or a spot at the hourly motel down the street. Both seemed equally important right now. His stomach was cramping from hunger, but the temperature was supposed to drop into the 30s tonight. That's when he heard it. Faint music drifting out each time someone opened the restaurant's front door. It wasn't the usual background music from their speakers. Someone was actually playing the piano inside, but they were playing it all wrong. David's trained ear immediately picked up the mistakes. The timing was off. The phrasing was clumsy. Whoever was playing had learned the notes but had completely missed the soul of the music. It was like watching someone read a love letter in the tone they'd use to read a grocery list. For the first time in months, David felt something other than despair. He felt the familiar itch in his fingers, the one that had driven him to practice for hours every day when he was young. The need to make music the way it was supposed to be made, to give voice to emotions that couldn't be expressed with words. He stood up slowly, his joints stiff from sitting on the cold concrete. The small pile of coins in his cup jingled as he picked it up. $3.37 now, thanks to the little girl's kindness. David looked at his reflection in the restaurant's window. His hair was longer than it had been in years, and he hadn't shaved in 3 days. His clothes were clean but obviously worn and patched in several places. He looked exactly like what he was, a homeless veteran who most people crossed the street to avoid. But inside that weathered exterior was still the heart of a musician. The part of him that understood how Chopin intended his nocturnes to flow like water, how Rachmaninoff's concertos should build like storms, how Bach's fugues could make mathematical precision feel like pure emotion. David took a deep breath and walked toward the restaurant's front door. He didn't have a plan exactly, but he knew he couldn't listen to that piano being tortured for another minute. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was just the memory of who he used to be. Whatever it was, it gave him the courage to push open the heavy glass door and step into a world he hadn't been part of for a very long time. Part 2. The desperate request, the warm air inside Romano's hit David like a wall. After hours in the cold, the sudden heat made his cheeks tingle and his eyes water slightly. The restaurant was everything he had imagined from the outside, elegant but not stuffy, with soft lighting that made everything look golden and inviting. The smell nearly knocked him over. Garlic bread, tomato sauce, fresh basil, and dozens of other scents that made his empty stomach clench with longing. He hadn't smelled real cooking in so long that for a moment he just stood there, breathing it in like it was medicine. A young hostess with perfectly styled hair and a crisp white shirt looked up from her reservation book. Her smile was bright and professional until she actually saw David. Then her expression shifted to something between confusion and alarm. Can I help you?" she asked, her voice careful and a little too loud, like she was talking to someone who might not understand English very well. David could feel every eye in the entrance area turning toward him. A couple waiting to be seated took a small step back, and the man's hand moved protectively to his wife's arm. David was used to these reactions by now, but inside a place like this, surrounded by warmth and prosperity, they hurt more than usual. "I'd like to speak with your manager, please," David said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. The hostess glanced toward the dining room, clearly hoping someone else would handle this situation. "Is there a problem?" "Because if you're looking for our restroom, it's for customers only." "I understand," David said. "I really do need to speak with your manager." The piano music continued in the background, and David winced as the player stumbled through what was supposed to be a beautiful Debussy piece. It was like listening to someone try to recite poetry while reading it for the first time, hitting all the words but missing all the meaning. The hostess disappeared into the dining room, leaving David standing in the entryway. He could hear her whispering urgently to someone, though he couldn't make out the words. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s approached, wearing a well-tailored suit and the kind of confident expression that came from years of running a successful business. "I'm Tony Romano," the man said, extending his hand. "This is my restaurant. Angela said you wanted to speak with me." David was surprised by the handshake. Tony's grip was firm and respectful, not the limp, reluctant contact he'd grown used to from people who were uncomfortable around him. "Mr. Romano, I know how this might sound," David began, his heart beating faster, "but I was wondering if I could play your piano in exchange for a meal." Tony's eyebrows went up and David could see him processing the request. Behind Tony, a small crowd had gathered, servers, the hostess, and even a few curious diners who had wandered over to see what was happening. "You want to play piano for food?" Tony asked, not mockingly, but like he was making sure he'd heard correctly. "Yes, sir," David said. "I know I don't look like much right now, but I used to be a professional pianist. I could play during the dinner service, maybe give your customers something special." One of the servers, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes, leaned over to Tony. "Should I call someone?" she whispered, but David heard her. Tony held up a hand to quiet her, studying David's face. "What kind of music do you play?" "Classical mostly, some jazz. I can do requests if people have favorites." David's hands were starting to shake again, partly from nerves and partly from the adrenaline of being the center of attention. From somewhere in the dining room, David heard a man laugh loudly. "This should be good," the voice said. "Dinner and a show." Tony shot a sharp look in that direction, then turned back to David. "Look, friend, I appreciate that you're trying to work instead of just asking for handouts. That says something about your character. But our piano player tonight is the owner's daughter. She's been taking lessons for 2 years, and this is kind of her debut performance." David glanced toward the dining room where the music was still playing. The young woman at the piano was clearly trying her best, but she was in over her head. She was playing the notes correctly, mostly, but there was no feeling behind them. It was like watching someone paint by numbers when what the room needed was art. "I understand," David said. "I don't want to take anyone's opportunity away. But maybe after she's finished, or during a break?" Tony looked genuinely torn. David could see the kindness in his eyes, but also the practical concerns of a business owner. Having a homeless man play piano in his upscale restaurant wasn't exactly good for the ambiance he was trying to create. "Here's the thing," Tony said carefully. "This is a family restaurant. I've got customers who've been coming here for years, you know. They trust me to give them a certain kind of experience." "I understand," David said again, though his heart was sinking. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just thought maybe—" His voice trailed off as his stomach gave an audible growl. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet entryway, and David felt his face burn with embarrassment. The server with kind eyes touched Tony's arm. "Mr. Romano, maybe we could at least give him something to eat. It's getting cold out there." Tony was quiet for a long moment, looking at David like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he sighed. "You know what? My daughter's going to take a break in about 20 minutes anyway. If you want to play one song, just one, I'll get you a full meal and send you home with leftovers. But if this goes wrong, if you upset my customers or cause any kind of scene, you'll need to leave immediately. Deal?" David's relief was so intense he felt dizzy. "Yes, sir, absolutely, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Tony said with a slight smile. "Let's see what you've got first." As Tony walked back into the dining room, David heard him addressing his staff and customers. "Folks, in about 20 minutes, we're going to have a special guest performer. Just something a little different for tonight." David found himself standing alone in the entryway again, but this time the hostess, Angela, looked at him differently. "That was really nice of Mr. Romano," she said quietly. "He's a good guy. He grew up around here, knows what it's like when times get tough." "He seems like it," David said. "I won't let him down." "What are you going to play?" Angela asked. David thought about it. He had one chance to show these people who he really was underneath the worn clothes and unwashed hair, one chance to prove that he was more than just another homeless person looking for a handout. One chance to remember what it felt like to be David Rodriguez, the pianist, instead of just David, the veteran who couldn't get his life together. "Something beautiful," he said finally. "Something that will remind people why music matters." From the dining room, he could hear Tony making an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, my daughter Lisa is going to take a short break, but we have a special treat for you tonight. We have a guest musician who's going to play for us." David heard the polite applause and a few curious murmurs. He also heard that same man from before say something that sounded like this ought to be interesting in a tone that suggested he expected to be entertained by David's failure. David closed his eyes and tried to center himself the way his old teacher had taught him years ago. He thought about all the concerts he'd played, all the hours of practice, all the times music had saved him when nothing else could. He thought about the little girl who had dropped $1 in his cup and told him she wanted to help sad people. Maybe, just maybe, he could help some people tonight too. Maybe he could show them that beautiful things could come from unexpected places, that dignity didn't depend on bank accounts or addresses, that music was a language that spoke to everyone regardless of their circumstances. In 20 minutes, he would find out if he was right. Part 3. The moment of truth. David stood at the edge of the dining room watching Tony's daughter Lisa finish her set. She was playing a simplified version of Für Elise, and despite her obvious nerves, she managed to get through it without any major mistakes. The audience gave her warm, encouraging applause, and David could see the pride on Tony's face as his daughter took a small bow. As Lisa gathered her sheet music, Tony approached the piano. "Thank you, everyone. Lisa's been working really hard on her music and we're so proud of her." More applause. "Now, as I mentioned, we have a special guest tonight. Please welcome David." That was his cue. David walked into the dining room and he could feel the energy change immediately. Conversations that had been flowing easily suddenly became whispered exchanges. He saw people doing double takes, trying to reconcile the homeless man they'd seen outside with someone who was apparently going to entertain them. The piano sat in the center of the room like an island of possibility. As David approached it, his hands started shaking worse than they had all day. Not from the cold this time, or even from hunger. This was pure terror. What if he'd forgotten how to play? What if 3 years of trauma and medication and sleeping on concrete had damaged something essential in his brain? What if his hands shook so badly that he embarrassed himself and Tony in front of all these people? He could hear chair legs scraping as people turned to get a better view. Someone's phone camera flashed, and David realized that his success or failure tonight might end up on social media. The thought made his stomach clench even tighter. David sat down on the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. The familiar feeling of the smooth wood beneath him was comforting, like greeting an old friend. He placed his hands on the keys without pressing them, just feeling the cool ivory beneath his fingertips. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the servers had stopped moving, and David could sense dozens of eyes watching his every move. He could practically hear people thinking, "What is this homeless guy going to do? Is this going to be a disaster?" He caught Tony's eye across the room. The restaurant owner was standing near the kitchen, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. David could see the worry there. Tony had taken a big risk, and he was probably wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. David took a deep breath and let his eyes fall closed. He tried to block out everything else, the staring faces, the whispered comments, the fear of failure. Instead, he reached for something deeper, the muscle memory that had been built over thousands of hours of practice, the emotional connection to music that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his life. He thought about his grandmother, who had first taught him to play on her old upright piano when he was 7 years old. "Music isn't about the notes on the page, mijo," she used to say. "It's about the feelings in your heart." David's hands found their position and he began to play. The first notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune floated into the air, soft and delicate as moonlight. But these weren't the tentative, mechanical notes that Lisa had been producing earlier. These notes had breath in them, life in them. They seemed to shimmer and dance, each one carefully placed and lovingly shaped. David felt his hands stop shaking almost immediately. This was home. This was who he was, underneath everything else that had happened to him. The piano didn't care about his circumstances or his appearance. It only cared about the music he brought to it. As the piece developed, David allowed himself to get lost in it completely. The melody line sang like a human voice, expressing longing and beauty and gentle sadness. His left hand provided a foundation that was rock solid but never heavy, supporting the melody without overwhelming it. The dining room had become completely still. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Forks had been set down on plates. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen, standing in the doorway with dish towels in their hands and wonder on their faces. David transitioned seamlessly into the more complex middle section of the piece, where Debussy's harmonies became richer and more adventurous. His fingers found every note with absolute precision, but more than that, they found the emotion behind every note. This wasn't just technical perfection. This was storytelling at the deepest level. He could sense the change in the room's energy. What had started as curiosity and skepticism was transforming into something else entirely. People were leaning forward in their chairs. A woman at a corner table had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with surprise. As the piece moved toward its climax, David opened his heart completely. He thought about everything he'd lost and everything he'd learned. He thought about the young soldiers he'd served with who hadn't made it home. He thought about the loneliness of sleeping in doorways and the kindness of strangers who dropped coins in his cup. All of it poured into the music. The piano became his voice, singing things that couldn't be said with words. The pain was there, but so was the beauty. The loss was there, but so was the hope. When David finally brought the piece to its quiet, gentle conclusion, the silence in the room was absolute. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Then someone started crying. It was the woman at the corner table. Tears were streaming down her face, and she wasn't trying to hide them. The music had touched something deep inside her, something that maybe she hadn't even known was there. She wasn't the only one. David could see other people wiping their eyes, their faces soft with emotion. The teenager at table 6 was staring at him like she'd just witnessed a miracle. Even the businessman who had made the sarcastic comment earlier was sitting perfectly still. His expression completely changed. David lifted his hands from the keys and looked up. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of people who had just experienced something extraordinary and were trying to process what they'd felt. Tony was the first to start clapping. His applause began slowly, almost reverently, but it quickly spread throughout the room. Soon everyone was applauding, and the sound was different from the polite appreciation they'd given Lisa. This was genuine awe. "Oh my God," David heard someone whisper. "That was incredible. Who is he?" someone else asked. Tony was walking toward the piano, his face bright with amazement. "David," he said when he reached him, I don't even have words." David stood up from the bench, his legs a little unsteady. The adrenaline was wearing off, and he was beginning to realize what had just happened. He had just reminded himself and everyone in this room that he was still a musician. That part of him hadn't died after all. "Thank you," David said quietly. "Thank you for giving me the chance." "And are you kidding me?" Tony said. "Thank you. I've never heard anything like that in my life." The woman who had been crying approached them, still wiping her eyes. "Excuse me," she said to David, but I have to ask, are you a professional musician?" David hesitated. How did he answer that question? "I used to be," he said finally. "You still are," she said firmly. "Whatever happened to you, whatever brought you here tonight, you're still one of the most gifted musicians I've ever heard." Other people were approaching now, all wanting to tell David how the music had moved them. An elderly man shook his hand and said it reminded him of his late wife. A young couple said they'd never understood classical music before tonight, but David barely heard them. He was looking at Tony, who was shaking his head in amazement. "David," Tony said, "I think we need to talk." Part 4. Recognition and Revelation. The applause had finally died down, but the atmosphere in Romano's had completely changed. Where there had been polite dinner conversation before, now there was an electric buzz of excitement and curiosity. David could see people pulling out their phones, some clearly wanting to record something, others already typing messages to friends and family. Tony guided David to a quiet corner booth while the kitchen staff prepared what looked like enough food to feed 3 people. "David," Tony said, sliding across from him, "I've got to ask, where did you learn to play like that?" David looked down at his hands, which had finally stopped shaking completely. For the first time in years, they felt like his hands again. "I went to music school. Performed professionally for about 15 years before I enlisted." "Enlisted?" Tony's eyebrows went up. "You're military?" "Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan." David's voice was quiet, but he wasn't ashamed anymore. Not after tonight. Before Tony could respond, the woman who had approached them earlier appeared at their table. She was in her 70s, well-dressed, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed familiar somehow. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I simply have to ask you something." She looked directly at David. Did you ever perform at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C.? This would have been about, 15 or 16 years ago. David felt his heart skip. Yes, ma'am. A few times, actually. Her face lit up. I knew it. You're David Rodriguez, aren't you? You performed Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto with the National Symphony. I was there that night. Front row, center seat. The recognition hit David like a physical blow. For years, he'd felt like that person. The acclaimed pianist David Rodriguez had been someone else entirely, like that life had belonged to a different man who just happened to share his name. Mrs. David started. Helen Morrison, she said, extending her hand. I'm a retired music professor from Georgetown University. I've been following classical music for over 40 years, and I have never forgotten that performance. It was absolutely transcendent. By now, other diners had noticed the conversation and were edging closer. David could see phones being held up, obviously recording. The teenager from table 6 had her device pointed directly at them. Wait, said a young man who had been sitting with his girlfriend near the window. Are you saying this guy is actually famous? Helen turned to address the growing crowd. This man is one of the most gifted classical pianists I've ever heard. He was featured in music magazines, performed with major orchestras across the country. David Rodriguez was considered one of the rising stars of his generation. David felt overwhelmed. Part of him wanted to sink under the table and disappear. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd been avoiding for years. But another part of him, the part that had just remembered what it felt like to make music again, was grateful that someone remembered who he used to be. What happened? Asked a woman from another table. The question wasn't cruel or gossipy. It was asked with genuine concern and curiosity. David looked around at all the faces watching him. A year ago, these same people would have crossed the street to avoid him. Now they were hanging on his every word. Life happened, David said simply. I came back from overseas with some challenges, lost my way for a while. PTSD? Asked the young man who had questioned his fame. When David nodded, the man's expression softened completely. My brother's dealing with that too. It's been really hard. The teenager with the phone suddenly gasped. Oh my God, this is already going viral. She held up her screen to show a video that had been posted just minutes ago. Someone posted the video of you playing and it already has like 10,000 views. David felt a chill run down his spine. What video? Someone recorded your performance, Tony explained. Look, in today's world, that's just what happens. But maybe it's not such a bad thing. The teenager continued scrolling through her phone. People are sharing it everywhere. Veteran pianist is already trending on Twitter. Listen to this comment. This is what real talent looks like. This man deserves so much better. And this one, added the young man, reading from his own phone. I was having the worst day until I heard this. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. Helen Morrison was watching David carefully. You know, David, I still have contacts in the classical music world. People who would be very interested to know that you're ready to play again. I don't know if I'm ready for that, David said honestly. I mean, tonight was wonderful, but this was just one song. I haven't performed professionally in years. I don't even have an instrument to practice on. Details. Helen waved her hand dismissively. Talent like yours doesn't just disappear. It might get buried under life's difficulties, but it's always there waiting. Tony was staring at his phone now too. David, you need to see this. The video of you playing has been shared by the official social media accounts of 3 different orchestras already. And look at this. Someone started a fundraising page. Help David Rodriguez get back on his feet. It's already raised over $3,000. David felt dizzy. This morning he'd been invisible. Just another homeless person that society had given up on. Now strangers on the internet were trying to help him. And some of the most important people in classical music were being reminded that he existed. I think, said Helen thoughtfully, that you've just reminded a lot of people about the power of second chances. A server appeared with David's meal, and it truly was enough food for 3 people. Chicken parmesan, pasta, salad, bread, and what looked like tiramisu for dessert. The sight of it made David's eyes water almost as much as the music had affected his audience. Tony, David said, this is too much. Actually, Tony said with a grin, I think it might not be enough. Helen, would you like to join us? I have a feeling this is going to be a long and very interesting conversation. As Helen slid into the booth beside Tony, David took his first real bite of food in days. The chicken was perfectly seasoned, the pasta was homemade, and for a moment he just closed his eyes and savored the simple pleasure of a good meal. When he opened them again, he realized that most of the restaurant was still watching him, but their expressions weren't uncomfortable or pitying anymore. They were hopeful, like they were watching something beautiful unfold and wanted to be part of it. "You know what the most amazing part of tonight is?" said the teenager who had introduced herself as Jessica. "It's not just that you're incredibly talented. It's that you reminded all of us that we don't really see people, like really see them." Her mother nodded in agreement. "I'm ashamed to admit that I probably would have walked past you on the street without a second thought. But you're a human being with a story and incredible gifts, and I almost missed that completely." "We all did," said the businessman who had made the sarcastic comment earlier. He looked genuinely embarrassed. "I owe you an apology. I was expecting—" "Well, it doesn't matter what I was expecting. What you gave us was pure magic." David looked around the table at these strangers who were quickly becoming something more than that. "You know, I've spent the last few years feeling like I was invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. Tonight, you've all reminded me that every person has value, even when they can't see it in themselves." Helen reached across the table and patted his hand. "David, I think you're about to discover that a lot of people have been waiting for you to come back. The classical music world isn't the same without voices like yours." Tony's phone buzzed with another notification. "The fundraising page just hit $10,000, he announced. "And I've gotten 3 calls from local news stations who want to do interviews." David felt overwhelmed again, but this time it was a good kind of overwhelmed. Like standing in front of an ocean of possibilities instead of drowning in an ocean of problems. "What do you think?" Helen asked gently. "Are you ready to let the world welcome you back?" David thought about the little girl who had dropped $1 in his cup and told him she wanted to help sad people. Maybe it was time to stop being sad and start helping other people remember what was possible. "I think," David said slowly, "I'm ready to try." Part 5. The Road Back Home. 6 months later, David stood backstage at the Grand Concert Hall, the same venue where he had performed over a decade ago when his career was at its peak. But tonight felt different from any performance he'd ever given. Tonight wasn't just about music, it was about homecoming. The fundraising page that had started that magical evening at Romano's had grown beyond anyone's imagination. What began as a few $1,000s had turned into nearly $200,000, along with offers of help from people all over the world. Musicians had donated instruments, therapists had offered free counseling, and veterans organizations had stepped forward with resources David didn't even know existed. But more importantly, the money had given David something he'd lost years ago: time. Time to heal, time to practice, time to remember who he was beyond his trauma and circumstances. He'd spent the first month in a small apartment that Helen Morrison had helped him find, just playing piano for hours every day. His hands had been stiff at first, his technique rusty, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. Within weeks, the pieces he'd performed hundreds of times were flowing from his fingers like water. The therapy had been harder than the music. Dr. Martinez, a specialist in veteran PTSD, had helped David understand that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened to him overseas or erasing the trauma of his homelessness. It was about integrating those experiences into a fuller picture of who he was. "You're not just David the pianist," Dr. Martinez had told him during one of their sessions. "You're David the veteran, David the survivor, David the human being who has experienced both incredible loss and incredible grace. All of those parts of you inform your music now." She was right. When David played now, there was a depth to his interpretation that hadn't been there before. The pain was part of it, but so was the gratitude. The music carried the weight of everything he'd been through, which made the beauty even more profound. Tonight's concert had been Helen's idea. A comeback performance, and she'd called it, though David preferred to think of it as a coming home performance. The venue had donated the space, local orchestral musicians had volunteered their time, and tickets had sold out within hours. But the most meaningful part was that Tony Romano and his entire family were sitting in the front row. Lisa, Tony's daughter, had become one of David's most dedicated students. Twice a week, she came to his apartment for piano lessons, and her playing had improved dramatically under his guidance. "Mr. David," she told him just last week, "you make the music sound like it's telling stories." That's because it is telling stories, David had replied. Every piece of music is a conversation between the composer and the performer and the audience. Our job is to make sure everyone can understand what's being said. David peeked out from behind the curtain at the packed auditorium. He spotted familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Jessica, the teenager who had first posted his video, was there with her family. The businessman who had apologized for his initial skepticism had bought a whole table of tickets for his colleagues. Helen Morrison was sitting with a group of her former students, beaming like a proud grandmother. In the back of the hall, David could see a group of veterans in their dress uniforms. Word had gotten out through veteran networks about his story, and many had driven hours to be here tonight. Some were in wheelchairs, some walked with canes, and David knew that many carried invisible wounds similar to his own. The program tonight was carefully chosen. He would start with Clair de Lune, the piece that had started it all at Romano's. Then Chopin's Ballade, No. 1, a piece that had always felt like an autobiography, to David, full of beauty and struggle and ultimate triumph. Finally, he would close with Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece Helen had heard him perform all those years. But there would be one addition to the program that no one in the audience knew about. David had spent the last month composing his own piece, something he'd never done before his experiences on the street. He'd titled it Invisible, and it was his musical reflection on what it meant to be overlooked by society and then suddenly seen again. The orchestra was taking their places now, and David could hear the conductor doing final sound checks. In 5 minutes, he would walk out onto that stage and perform for the first time since his breakdown. Part of him was terrified, but a bigger part of him was excited to share what he'd learned during his journey through darkness and back into the light. A stagehand appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Rodriguez, it's time." David walked to the edge of the stage and paused. He thought about the man who had sat on those restaurant steps 6 months ago, hungry and hopeless and convinced that his life was over. That man could never have imagined this moment. As he stepped into the bright stage lights, the audience erupted in applause. But it wasn't the polite, reserved applause of a typical classical concert. This was the warm, emotional applause of people who had followed his story and were genuinely happy to see him succeed. David sat down at the beautiful grand piano, another Steinway. He noticed with a smile and adjusted the bench. The concert hall fell silent, just as Romano's restaurant had fallen silent that night 6 months ago. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play Clair de Lune. But this wasn't the same performance he'd given that night. This version carried everything that had happened since then: the kindness of strangers, the support of his community, the hard work of healing, the joy of rediscovering his purpose. When the piece ended, the silence was deep and reverent. Then someone in the veteran section started clapping, and the applause spread like a wave through the entire hall. But David wasn't finished. He stood up and walked to the microphone that had been set up beside the piano. 6 months ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, I was homeless and hungry, sitting outside a restaurant and feeling invisible. Tonight I'm here because a restaurant owner named Tony Romano took a chance on me, because a woman named Helen Morrison remembered who I used to be, and because hundreds of strangers decided that everyone deserves a second chance. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I want to play something for you that I've never performed before. It's a piece I wrote about the experience of being overlooked and then suddenly seen. I hope it reminds all of us to really look at the people around us, because you never know what gifts they might be carrying. David returned to the piano and began to play Invisible. The piece started quietly, almost timidly, with notes that seemed to hide from each other. Gradually it grew stronger and more confident, building to a powerful climax before settling into a peaceful, grateful conclusion. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The applause went on for nearly 5 minutes, with people standing and cheering and calling out, "Bravo!" But the moment that meant the most to David came during intermission, when a young veteran in a wheelchair approached him. "Mr. Rodriguez," the young man said, "I just wanted to thank you. I've been struggling since I got back from overseas, and seeing what you've overcome, it gives me hope that things can get better for me too." David knelt down beside the wheelchair so they could talk at eye level. "What's your name, son?" "Christopher. Chris Thompson." Well, Chris, I want you to know that your service matters, your struggles are valid, and your life has value even when it doesn't feel like it. If there's anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to ask. Chris nodded, tears in his eyes. Just knowing that someone like you made it through, that's help enough. As David returned to the stage for the second half of the concert, he realized that this was what his music had always been meant for. Not just to entertain or to showcase technical skill, but to connect human hearts and remind people of their shared dignity and potential. The Rachmaninoff concerto that closed the evening was performed with an emotional depth that surprised even David. Every note seemed to carry the weight of his journey, the loss, the despair, the kindness of strangers, and the joy of redemption. When the final notes faded away, the audience leaped to their feet as one. The applause seemed to go on forever, and David could see people wiping their eyes throughout the hall. But the most beautiful sight was in the front row, where Tony Romano was applauding with tears streaming down his face, and his daughter Lisa was bouncing in her seat with excitement. Later at the reception, David found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand and share their own stories. A woman told him about her brother who was struggling with addiction. A businessman talked about the homeless people he'd started noticing on his walk to work. A teenager said she'd decided to volunteer at a veterans center because of his story. You know what the best part of tonight was? Helen Morrison asked him as the evening was winding down. What's that? Watching you remember that you were never really invisible. You were always David Rodriguez, the pianist. Circumstances just made it hard for people to see you clearly. Tonight they saw you again. David looked around the room at all the people who had become part of his extended family over the past 6 months. Tomorrow he would start his new job as a resident musician at the Grand Concert Hall, a position that had been created specifically for him. Next month he would begin working with other homeless veterans,